The rope creaked under the weight of judgment. It was a cold morning in Kraków, and the air carried the heavy silence of reckoning. Before a grim audience of justice officials and prison staff, Arthur Liebehenschel, former Commandant of Auschwitz and Majdanek, took his final breath. His crimes had stained the earth, but now the world stood still as justice closed its grip. This is not a story for the faint-hearted. It is a confrontation with human cruelty, structured, calculated, and bureaucratized into a system of horror. Liebehenschel was not the most infamous among the SS, yet the deaths under his watch, the orders signed, the lives crushed, mark him among the architects of genocide. Today, we unearth his story, not for shock, but for memory. Because evil, dressed in rank and obedience, must never be forgotten. Arthur Liebehenschel was born on November 25, 1901 in Posen, then part of the German Empire. A quiet, educated man with a military background, he did not fit the stereotypical image of a sadistic brute, and that made him more dangerous. In 1932, he joined the Nazi Party and, shortly after, the SS. His trajectory into the darkest corridors of power was swift. He became deeply embedded in the SS Totenkopfverbände, the units responsible for running the concentration camps. By the late 1930s, Liebehenschel had risen to a key administrative post in the Inspectorate of Concentration Camps, the body that oversaw the operation of camps across the Reich. His experience, discipline, and loyalty made him invaluable to the machinery of death. In December 1943, he was appointed Commandant of Auschwitz I. Although historians note he attempted some limited reforms, such as removing certain forms of torture, these gestures were cosmetic. The camp's function as a center of mass murder remained unchanged. When he was later transferred to Majdanek in May 1944, he continued to manage the logistics of extermination with calm precision. Liebehenschel was not known for outbursts of violence. He was methodical, soft-spoken, and bureaucratic, a man who signed off on human suffering from behind a desk. He was the kind of officer the Nazi system relied on: efficient, obedient, and disturbingly indifferent. His legacy is one of quiet brutality. He may not have been Josef Mengele or Rudolf Höss, but his complicity in genocide was no less complete. When Auschwitz survivors later testified, they did not remember sadism, they remembered cold efficiency. As the Third Reich crumbled in 1945, Arthur Liebehenschel was arrested by American forces in Bavaria. He was initially detained with other SS officers, but due to his direct command over 2 extermination camps, he was soon identified as a major war criminal. In 1947, he was extradited to Poland to stand trial in Kraków, the epicenter of post-war justice for Auschwitz personnel. The Auschwitz trials, conducted by the Supreme National Tribunal of Poland, began in November 1947. Liebehenschel stood alongside 40 other former SS staff from Auschwitz.
He faced charges of crimes against humanity, particularly for his role in overseeing mass murder, slave labor, and the torture of prisoners. Unlike some of his co-defendants, Liebehenschel did not loudly proclaim his innocence. His demeanor in court was restrained, almost clinical. He acknowledged certain facts, but downplayed his involvement in selections and killings, claiming he tried to improve conditions, a defense echoed by others, hoping to appear less monstrous in the eyes of the court. But the evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses described the brutalities committed under his command, including mass shootings, starvation, and the lethal conditions of forced labor. The court rejected the argument that administrative reforms absolved him of guilt. On December 22, 1947, Arthur Liebehenschel was found guilty and sentenced to death. He was one of 23 defendants condemned in the trial, a stark reminder that even those who wore the appearance of civility could be guilty of the gravest atrocities. His sentence was final. There would be no appeals, no delay. Justice, in post-war Poland, was swift. Contrary to some beliefs or sensational retellings, the execution of Arthur Liebehenschel was not carried out in a public square or before a crowd of spectators. Instead, it took place behind the stone walls of Majdanek prison in Kraków on January 24, 1948. This former Gestapo prison, infamous during the war for torture and executions, now served a different purpose: justice.
While the executions of Nazi war criminals were widely reported and followed with intense interest across Europe, the actual proceedings were intentionally restricted. Liebehenschel's hanging, like those of the 21 other Auschwitz personnel condemned in the Kraków trials, was semi-private. Only a small group of individuals, state officials, court representatives, prison staff, and selected witnesses were allowed to attend. There were no civilians present. Photographs were forbidden. The Polish government sought justice, not a circus. At dawn, Liebehenschel was led to the gallows. Unlike some of his SS peers who cursed their enemies or clung to denial, he offered no last words. According to prison logs and sparse witness accounts, he remained eerily calm, perhaps resigned, perhaps still numb to the scale of the suffering he enabled. The moment came quickly. One step, one drop, and the quiet was final. The man who once signed orders for the transport and extermination of thousands now met his end by a legal system he had tried to escape. For many survivors and families of the murdered, the execution held deep symbolic power. While no death could reverse the horrors of the Holocaust, seeing one of its architects held accountable in the same country where the crimes took place offered a measure of closure. This was not a public hanging in the traditional sense, but the message was loud and clear. The world had not forgotten. Arthur Liebehenschel's execution was one of many in the wave of post-war justice, yet his legacy continues to provoke difficult questions about guilt, humanity, and remembrance.
Unlike some high-profile Nazis, Liebehenschel did not leave behind bombastic speeches or a public defiance. He left silence and survivors' memories. In Poland, the trials and executions were seen as a necessary act of justice. The wounds of Nazi occupation were fresh, and Auschwitz was not just a symbol, it was local, lived trauma. The Kraków trials gave voice to the survivors, allowing the world to hear what had happened inside the camps. Liebehenschel, with his polished demeanor and restrained cruelty, represented a chilling reality. Mass murder did not always come from monsters, but from managers. In Germany, especially in the post-war decades, discussion around Liebehenschel was quieter. He was overshadowed by more notorious figures like Hus or Himmler. But his legacy resurfaced in an unexpected way through his daughter. Barbara Cherish, born during the war, later wrote a memoir titled The Auschwitz Commandant, a daughter's search for the father she never knew. Her book did not excuse his actions, but revealed the emotional aftermath for families tied to the perpetrators of genocide. It became part of the broader effort to humanize the historical reckoning, not to forgive, but to understand the long shadows of the Holocaust. Today, Liebehenschel's name is largely buried within the grim rosters of Nazi officials, yet historians still examine his role because it reflects a broader truth. The Holocaust was not only carried out by fanatics, but also by bureaucrats who kept the trains running and the orders signed.
He died with little protest, but history will not let him disappear so quietly. The execution of Arthur Liebehenschel did not make global headlines for long. He slipped into the footnotes of history, a quieter figure among louder monsters. But his story matters, precisely because of that quiet. He was not a raving ideologue. He was not visibly sadistic. He was organized, efficient, and loyal. He made death a process, not a spectacle. By the time the rope tightened around his neck in Majdanek prison, he had become a symbol of a different kind of evil, the one that wears a uniform, fills out paperwork, and follows orders without hesitation. His execution was the legal end of a man, but not of what he represented. That spirit, of cold compliance, of moral emptiness behind professional duty, is harder to hang. In telling this story, we do not seek vengeance. We seek clarity. To understand how ordinary men, given power and ideology, can engineer extraordinary cruelty. Liebehenschel's name may not be etched in infamy like others, but the system he served was no less deadly. Justice came for him, as it should, but for us, justice must also mean remembrance. It means continuing to speak the names of the victims, to recognize the warning signs, to never allow such a system to rise again under any flag or cause. In the end, the question is not how Arthur Liebehenschel died, but how many more like him might be willing to live again.